The all-new and all-boxy Hyundai Ioniq 5 has certainly received a lot of press lately, but you might not know that there is another Hyundai EV around, the Kona EV. This has been in the Hyundai lineup for a while, but it has recently received a refresh, and you notice the big portion of that refresh, which is the front-end design right here. The Kona is sort of the Swiss Army knife of crossovers in Hyundai's lineup. There's a battery electric version, a full-on N performance version, a regular turbo version, and then a less expensive version if cost is your absolute concern. But speaking of cost, this is one of the least expensive new EVs in America. This is right about the same starting price as the Chevy Bolt EUV, and like the Bolt, this is based around a compact crossover. But honestly, even though this is related to the gasoline variants, and theoretically the Bolt is a unique vehicle in its own right, this comes across as a much more competent EV and better rounded. Let's take a look at the refresh here. You can see that we still have the divorced headlight arrangement that we've seen in the Kona for a while, but it's much better integrated with the front end. And Hyundai decided to completely delete a grille in the EV versions. This has this sort of masked off look that we find in modern Teslas. You'll find the LED headlights down here. LED headlights are not standard because this starts at around $34,000, so regular halogen lamps in that model. Limited amount of cooling down there. Radar sensor right in the middle for the adaptive safety systems. And a feature that we've seen in the Kona EV for a while, the charge port. It's located right over here on the driver's side. I'd love to know what you think about this charge door location. I love it. I had an EV once with the charge door up front. I thought it was the best thing ever. But then I was reminded that not everybody lives in an area like I do. Some people live in a place that it snows or has a lot of bugs, etc. And in those environments, you'll definitely notice that you'll have to deal with that on the charge door. At right around 165 inches long, the Kona and the Kona EV are technically subcompact crossovers in the US. In terms of the competition, this slots right between the Chevy Bolt and the Chevy Bolt EUV in terms of length, but in terms of interior practicality, it's honestly closer to the Bolt EUV. Versus Hyundai's all-new Ioniq 5, this is notably shorter. So if you're looking for something a bit more spacious on the inside, certainly a bit wider, keep that in mind. Also wider, the closely related EV6. I should say closely related to the Ioniq 5 because the close relation to this one is actually a bit more like the Soul EV that we do not get in the US, that is sold in Europe. The subcompact dimensions of the Bolt EUV, and the Kona are important to keep in mind if you're considering one of these and you're also cross-shopping something like the new Ioniq 5, because it is going to have a wider cargo area in the Ioniq 5 than we find here. You'll really notice that if I open up this hatch here, the opening is quite a bit smaller, and the cargo area itself is of course smaller. It's just because this is a subcompact vehicle and the entire car is narrower. You can see that we have the same sort of divorced lamp arrangement right back here that we found up front. Turn signals blinking over there. You'll also find the backup lights down here at the bottom of the bumper. Something that I didn't expect is that the backup lights are still incandescent, but the turn signals, those are full LEDs now. As you might expect out of a good urban EV, we have well-integrated parking sensors on the back bumper, but oddly enough, none on the front. A lot of you are probably thinking, with the advent of the Ioniq 5, why does Hyundai still have the Kona EV? How is it still relevant? Well, there are a number of good reasons that you might want to consider this over the base version of the Ioniq 5, which is going to arrive a little bit later this year. The first one obviously is cost. This is less expensive. In fact, the most expensive version of this Kona EV is actually about the same price as the least expensive version of the Ioniq 5 that you can buy today on dealer lots. The gap will narrow once that standard range version arrives, but this is still going to have a few advantages. This has more power, 201 horsepower out of this electric motor up front, versus about 150, 160 horsepower in the rear for that Ioniq 5, and it's still going to have a bigger battery pack and longer range than that standard range version. If you want more range, you will of course be able to find that in the Ioniq 5, but interestingly, only if you choose the extended range rear-wheel drive version. If you choose the all-wheel drive one, which is going to be faster than this, it actually drops down to about the same as the Kona EV. Now, the one thing you'll notice is missing under this hood is any sort of storage area, even though this is based on an existing ICE platform. The likely reason for that is simply cost, because as you can see, there's plenty of room between the hood and the top of this motor and inverter module right there, plenty of room on either side. They could have given us some storage space under here. They just chose not to spend the money there. As you'd logically expect out of Hyundai's entry-level EV, charging times are longer in this than in the new Ioniq 5. This has an onboard 7.2 kilowatt AC charger, so charging at home or at the office is going to take 25 to 30% longer than in the new Ioniq 5. DC fast charging, that is going to be significantly slower in this. The Ioniq 5 is blazing fast. It will go 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes, and I have verified that myself. This is going to take 47 minutes to accomplish that same 10% to 80% run. In terms of miles gained per minute of DC fast charging, this is going to charge faster than the Chevy Bolt, the Bolt EUV, and even the new Subaru Solterra and Toyota BZ4X. Those two vehicles actually charge quite slowly in terms of modern EVs, and because they're less efficient than this Kona right here, even though they're charging at a slightly faster rate, it'll actually take you longer to get 200 miles of range added, for instance. The Kona doesn't offer the new lounge seat that we find in the Ioniq 5, but this top-end version still has a pretty comfortable driver's seat. It's a multi-way adjustable unit with a two-way lumbar there, and we have a tilt-telescopic steering column with a moderate range of motion. Even in this trim, the passenger seat remains a manual seat, and it doesn't adjust for height. It is a little bit higher off the ground than the driver's seat, so taller folks might be a little less comfortable over there. The Kona may be small, but it does have a surprising amount of room in the back. Now, this front seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I have about 2 inches of legroom left, so obviously really long-legged people or child seats might have trouble fitting back here, but you could easily take 4 people for a short road trip or away to lunch and have absolutely no problem. I have plenty of headroom back here, about an inch left because this is pretty square and upright. And if I had to, I suppose you could fit 3 people across the back. But again, keep in mind this is narrower than something like an Ioniq 5 or another compact EV. This is subcompact. And here, because the seat is a little higher off the ground, my head is definitely touching the ceiling. Scooting all the way over to the right, this front seat's all the way back in its tracks. I have about half an inch left. Because the underbody of the Kona EV was significantly modified versus the regular Kona, we appear to have a very slightly different hump and a slightly different floor shape in this vehicle. So this is not quite skateboard flat, but it's actually pretty close. Behind the manual hatch, we find 19.2 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That's basically the same as the regular Kona because the battery pack is completely under the vehicle. Keep in mind, again, this is a subcompact vehicle, so you can put 22-inch roller bags in this position. You got to kind of squeeze them right over here to the center, but you can line up about 3 of them in the rear and still close the hatch. You could, of course, also remove this hard cargo cover right here, and then you'd be able to line up 22-inch roller bags in that position, and if you're careful, just barely close the rear hatch. Going in for a closer look, we have 60/40 folding rear seats, a load floor that lifts up to reveal some additional storage. I can also remove this foam divider. If I take that out of the way, we can then lower the load floor into an alternate height position with a little ramp up there to help things go towards the folding rear seat backs. Or I can take this completely out, and there's even more storage under the well. This last foam divider is in what looks sort of like a spare tire well, but the floor of this vehicle is different than the regular Kona, so I don't think you could fit a spare tire in here. But if you want to, you can take this foam divider completely out and use all of the storage space down there. As we look around the interior, keep in mind this is the most expensive version of the Kona EV, but it's also about the same price as the least expensive version of the Ioniq 5 currently available. We have a standard-sized moonroof, and it does open. So if you're looking for an EV with an opening sunroof, this definitely should be on your list. We have height-adjustable shoulder belts and height-adjustable headrests for the driver and front passenger. The bulk of this interior is shared with the regular Kona, so we have pretty thickly padded front seat backs that are pretty comfortable, and we have ventilated front seats. You can see the perforations in the upholstery here. That's something that we don't see in a wide variety of EVs. It's always struck me funny because it's a lot more energy efficient to heat or cool the seat surface than heat or cool the air in the vehicle. Moving over to the front doors, we find a two-tone style. Hard plastics down there at the bottom of the door right around the bottle holder. And again, the same sort of dashboard that we find in the rest of the Kona lineup. Hard plastics up top, some rubbery plastics right here in the middle, and then harder plastics down at the bottom. Pretty large glove compartment right there. You can easily put a large tablet computer inside. This model has the large touchscreen infotainment system. It's just over 10 inches. It does not support wireless CarPlay just yet, which I've always thought was a weird miss for the larger system in Hyundai's lineup. This is running their latest infotainment software, however. It's reliable, pretty easy to use. It does give us a little bit of extra EV information. Something you should definitely keep in mind is that Hyundai's infotainment software, even in the Ioniq 5, does not plan DC fast charging stops for you. Hopefully that's something that's coming up in a later software update, but for the moment, keep that in mind. Lots of physical buttons down there at the bottom of the screen. Power button there for the vehicle, single zone automatic climate control, lots of buttons here in the center console. This little door closes off, that's where the Qi wireless charging mat and the USB input are there, but you can see it's a little bit tight to try and close that on some of the larger smartphones. Same sort of push button style shifter we've seen in other Hyundais before. Electric parking brake, 2 big cup holders there. A lot of buttons back here. These are the toggles for the heated and ventilated seats, the vehicle's drive mode selector, heated steering wheel, and auto brake hold. On the driver's side, we have a full LCD instrument cluster. You can select the theme over here in the infotainment system, or you can have it linked to the drive mode. And you can see that there are 4 different themes. The white face theme reminds me of a 2000 Chrysler LHS. We also have a sportier look right there. This is the one that I prefer, and if you like cubes, you can go for this look. The steering wheel is a round design with sport grips up top and a split bottom spoke. On the back of the wheel, we have Regen Paddles. These are a really nice touch that we find in other Hyundai EVs. This commands more regen, this one over here commands less regen, and you can see that little display right there by the cube that toggles through those various levels of regeneration. So if you want aggressive regeneration, you can just click that all the way down. If you want to coast, you can do that as well. But this doesn't really have the same sort of one-pedal drive mode that we find in some newer EVs. It does, however, let you adjust the regeneration based on the drive mode that you're in, and you can have smart regeneration where the vehicle is automatically going to regenerate based on driving situation, which will include vehicle in front of you with the adaptive cruise control sensor. On the right side of the wheel, we have the buttons for the infotainment system along with the programmable favorites button, and then on the right side, we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control. If you thought earlier in the video that it looked like it was going to rain, you're right, it is definitely raining now. And that may or may not be the best time to talk about how the Kona EV drives. This is a front-wheel drive EV, so it is going to feel a little bit more predictable, a little bit more sure-footed to a lot of people out on the road like this versus the base versions of the Ioniq 5, the EV6, the Model 3, etc. Those are all rear-wheel drive-based EVs, as is the Volkswagen Id4. And the vast majority of new vehicles sold in America, they're actually front-wheel drive. And so a lot more people are used to the way front-wheel drive vehicles behave. They do tend to be a little bit more predictable. And of course, front-wheel drive really does make sense for a single-motor EV, because when we're talking about regenerative braking, we'll talk about that in a little bit, remember that the front wheels are the ones doing the majority of the braking, so the better regenerative braking potential happens on the front axle. There are also some dynamic reasons for that as well. But first, let's talk about 0 to 60. This went 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds. I did run one run at 6.4 seconds, that was kind of the outlier, but this is definitely fairly quick. For most folks out there, this is going to be just about as fast as the Kona with the 1.6-liter turbo engine. It's not going to be as fast as the Kona N. I have to admit, I'm a little bit disappointed that Hyundai didn't just decide to throw caution to the wind and just dial this all the way up. Although the logical reason for that, I'm sure, is that on this road surface, I just can't floor the Kona N because the front tires just don't have that kind of traction. This does have low rolling resistance tires on it, and that is going to be a big difference between this and the rest of the Kona lineup. These tires definitely don't have the same level of grip. They're also narrower than some versions of the Kona at 215 wide. That's probably one of the reasons that Hyundai didn't dial up the power more rapidly, is that if they had just dialed up any more power, these tires wouldn't be able to handle it, and they would have had to have gone for less efficient, wider, grippier tires. The tires choice on this vehicle also affects the stopping distance. 60 miles an hour back to 0 took 135 feet. That is definitely on the long side for a subcompact crossover like this. Now, if you wanted to get better stopping distances, you could replace these tires with grippier tires, summer tires, etc. That would have a massive impact on stopping distance, but it would also have an impact on range, although perhaps not as big as Hyundai had feared. With the recent tire swap that we did in our long-term Ford Mustang Mach-E, we noticed basically a 5 to 6% drop in efficiency and range, and I think that's perfectly acceptable to get the extra stopping distance and extra handling ability. Now, when it comes to handling ability, this has a good feel to it. Obviously, it's not going to handle quite as well as the lighter versions of the Kona. Obviously, that Kona N is going to be the ultimate in handling for this small vehicle. But handling is pretty decent thanks to the low center of gravity and the way the suspension has been designed. It has a good, solid, stable feel to it. It doesn't get upset over broken pavement, even in corners on broken pavement. And in that respect, this is above average for a compact crossover or a subcompact crossover or a subcompact or compact hatch. Versus the new Ioniq 5 and the EV6, this definitely feels smaller, it feels easier to park, and it feels a little bit more willing to turn around these tight, winding roads. But again, the laws of physics must be obeyed, and when it comes to the actual handling score compared to all those available options, I'm going to have to give this a B- when it comes to handling. I think that could honestly be improved to maybe an A- or an A by a simple tire swap. Thanks to the added weight of the battery pack, I think the Kona EV is the best riding version of the Kona. The suspension is still a little bit more firm than you might want, so if you want something a little bit more supple, you're going to want the Ioniq 5 or the EV6, or some of the newer crop of less firmly sprung EVs. I think this rides better than the Mach-E or the Tesla Model Y or the Tesla Model 3, however. Those all have a very firm and bouncy ride that some people definitely are interested in because it helps improve handling. But if you want something that's going to be a little more comfortable in your daily commute, this is going to be a good middle ground between those options and the newer Ioniq 5. Where the Kona really shines is if you live in city areas or out in rural areas like this where the roads are small and winding, because this definitely has a really nice feel to it. This is the kind of vehicle that fits easily in urban and suburban environments. Parking spaces are not a problem at all. And on really narrow roads like this, the Kona doesn't feel overly large like some EVs can. Out on our usual test surface when it's not raining, I measured 72 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, making this one of the quieter options in the subcompact crossover segment. You can really thank the battery pack for that. Skateboard-style batteries really have a big impact on cabin noise because a lot of the road noise that is transmitted through the body doesn't just come from the wheel wells, it also can come from the understructure of the vehicle, and by putting a big battery pack in the way, you really reduce a lot of that noise. Electric cars also generally have a little bit more attention paid to aerodynamics, so you will get a little bit less wind noise in here than in some of the competitive non-EVs. Now let's talk about range and efficiency. In my usual range test, on a 244-mile loop, this was easily able to achieve that and then drive all the way to 255 miles before it indicated it was at 0. That puts this definitely among the most efficient electric vehicles on sale in the US. If you want something that's more efficient than this, you're going to have to buy a Tesla, and you're going to have to pay an awful lot more for that added efficiency. Higher efficiency obviously means lower operating costs, but it also means that it's not going to take you as long to charge this, especially if you only have access to slower charging. Say if you only have a 3 kilowatt or a 6 kilowatt EVSE available at home, this is going to gain range considerably faster than the less efficient EV. Now there is a big consideration that you should know about. In the United States, the Kona EV is no longer available with an optional heat pump. That is something that Hyundai had offered in previous versions of the Kona EV, but it is not offered anymore. Now it does appear that Hyundai is still equipping Kona EVs with a heat pump in Canada. So if you're watching this in Canada, you are still going to get that efficiency bump in colder weather up there. But in the United States, you're not going to get that. That is important to keep in mind if you're watching other EV channels. For instance, Bjorn in Norway, he got some really excellent winter range out of the Kona EV, but his has a heat pump on it, and this one does not. The difference is definitely noticeable. For instance, right now it is only 50 degrees outside, so it's really not that cold compared to the cold temperatures that you might get in Washington State or New York State, where this is also available, but available without a heat pump. But if I hop into my brand new Kia EV6 and I set the climate control to the same temperature, its climate control is only using 700 watts because it has a heat pump and this one does not. And if you're in Canada, you're going to notice that your Kona EV is going to use a lot less electricity to heat the cabin than this. Depending on your driving style and the climate that you live in, this may or may not make too much difference. If, for instance, you have the climate control set pretty high, you will notice a decent reduction in your range, but you'll still be able to get at least 180, perhaps 200 miles out of the Kona EV, and that's still a pretty decent range. The most important thing to remember about this EV is that it's not trying to be a Tesla Model 3 or a Tesla Model Y or a Mustang Mach-E or even an Ioniq 5. This is trying to be an entry-level electric vehicle. And when you view it through that perspective and that lens, it's an absolutely incredible small EV. I think that everything about this is just better done than what we find in the Bolt and the Bolt EUV. The only thing that the Bolt EUV has that I really kind of wish this had was the lane centering system that we find in the Bolt EUV or Super Cruise, because I think those are both done better in that. Obviously, there's no Super Cruise-like function in this vehicle, and even though the Bolt EUV gets the previous generation of Super Cruise, it is available and it is pretty cool. One of the most interesting things about the Kona EV is that this is soon going to be one of the least expensive EVs you can buy in America that still has a federal tax credit. It starts at $34,700. It's going to be well under $30,000 after that tax credit. And the tax credits are definitely an important thing to a lot of EV shoppers. Tesla lost it first because they sold the most EVs. Then GM lost it. Now it looks like Toyota, Ford, and Nissan are going to start sunsetting sometime later this year, with Nissan perhaps dragging it out for just a little bit longer. And then hot on their heels is BMW. And remember, Mini goes with BMW because they're the same company. But let's get back to the price tag of the Kona EV for just one moment. It only comes in two different trims, SEL and Limited at the moment. The Limited trim adds LED interior lights, LED tail lights, rain-sensing wipers, leather seats. Yes, not vegan leather. It actually comes with leather. Power seat, ventilated front seats, bigger infotainment system, premium audio, heated steering wheel, adaptive cruise control as well. All of that for $42,500. That is more than the upcoming base version of the Hyundai Ioniq 5. Although, again, that Ioniq 5 base version comes with 168 horsepower, so less power and less range with 220 miles of range. But it has faster charging and it's rear-wheel drive. But since that model's not out yet, let's instead talk about the more direct competition from other car companies. I think the first competitor we have to talk about needs to be the Bolt EUV, because it is so much like the Kona in terms of general size, general shape, and sort of general purpose, to be honest, as well. Price-wise, it's pretty similar, $33,500, but again, no federal tax credit. This is where I would remind you that in order to get the full federal tax credit, you have to have a minimum federal tax liability, means you have to owe the federal government at least $7,500 of federal taxes every year. If you don't owe that much, then you are not going to get the full federal tax credit regardless of what you buy, and it can't be carried over. So be sure and check with a tax professional before you depend on that credit in order to afford a new EV. Now, statistically, most EV shoppers do qualify for that full federal tax credit, but if you only owe the federal government maybe $1,000 a year in taxes, then this is probably not going to be a big deal. You should actually just go off the MSRP and pick the vehicle that is right for you, because you won't really be getting much of a federal tax credit there. But if you do qualify for it, that's going to be a big ouchie. Range comes in a little bit lower at 247 miles of range in the Bolt EUV, so just a little bit less there. It has Super Cruise, which is totally cool, but not the current generation Super Cruise. It uses the last generation one from Cadillac. It is definitely much better looking than the original Chevy Bolt, but I don't think it's quite as cute as the Kona. Let me know what you think about that down there. The big benefit to the Bolt EUV is that it's been stretched over the regular Bolt, and almost all that stretch goes to rear legroom, so it is definitely roomier feeling than the Kona. Although, like the Kona, it's a subcompact vehicle, so it's really not very wide. The interior, the cabin, etc., it all feels a little bit pinched in the sideways direction. And an important counterpoint to having more legroom is that you have notably less cargo room, which is already at a premium in a vehicle this size. Now, we can't talk about the Bolt EUV without talking about some of the battery pack replacement drama and the fires, etc. Keep in mind that, interestingly enough, the Kona EV has also had some recalls due to this, because LG, the company that makes Chevy's battery pack, is also the company that made the Kona battery pack, and the exact same issue in manufacturing ended up affecting both vehicles, although to a much more limited extent as far as the Kona goes. More of a problem to some people are going to be the charging rates that vary between these two vehicles. The Bolt EUV gets faster level 2 charging, but decently slower DC fast charging. So if you're going to look for an inexpensive e-vehicle and you want to have a little bit of road tripping potential, you might want to take a look at the Kona. If you never plan on road tripping and you just want that faster range recovery at home or at the office, then you're going to want the Bolt EUV. If you live in a colder climate, then you're probably not going to want either of these, because neither one includes a heat pump from the factory in the United States. Next up, we have the Nissan Leaf. This has to be on the list because it is so inexpensive. It starts at $27,400, and at least for the moment, it has the federal tax credit, although that is likely going to start sunsetting once the new Aria comes on the scene. There are 2 different batteries and 2 different motors on offer in the Leaf, and that is important to keep in mind. Although, generally speaking, there's a lot of cash on the hood for the Leaf because sales have not been great lately. The small battery only comes with the less powerful motor. It gives you 149 miles of range and 147 horsepower. The big battery comes only with the big motor. That gives you 226 miles of range and 214 horsepower. Both are below the Kona. But the Leaf is a bigger vehicle on the inside, so it definitely feels roomier. It has a considerably bigger cargo area, and it is a little bit more practical, I would say, generally speaking, than the Kona. I think that although it's not the most attractive vehicle in this segment, it is significantly prettier than when the Leaf first launched. If you're considering a Leaf because of its low sticker price, there are definitely 2 downsides you should keep in mind. The first one is the battery pack is not actively heated or actively cooled. It's a passive cooled battery, and that means that battery performance and battery lifetime in hot climates and in cold climates is likely going to be well below other modern EVs. The other thing to keep in mind is that it uses a DC fast charge standard that has fallen out of vogue. It's known as CHAdeMO, it uses a different connector, and it is not compatible with CCS. CCS is the DC fast charge standard that every other new EV in America outside of Tesla uses currently. So going forward, we're only going to be seeing really new stations built with CCS and Tesla connectors. Some charging networks out there have given a very muddled view of the future of CHAdeMO. They've promised to continue supporting it, but we are not seeing any kind of rapid expansion in CHAdeMO DC fast charging. Outside of inner city areas where you will definitely find CHAdeMO charge plugs, you're not going to find as many on those long-haul interstate routes as the newer CCS standard. And part of that is because even Nissan has given up on it. So the next generation of Nissan's EVs, they're not going to use the same DC charge connector that we find in the Leaf. Also on the inexpensive list, we have the Mini Cooper that starts at $29,900, but it is a pretty small EV and it has a pretty short range, just 114 miles, so less than half the range that we find in the Kona EV. The interior is honestly pretty tight compared to the Kona. It's a two-door vehicle, it has a pretty tiny trunk, and the Mini Cooper is just really small. But if you're looking for something that is a blast to drive, is really attractive, and definitely has a more premium feel, that's going to be the Mini. Next up, we have what I think is going to be one of the most important EVs worldwide. It's the Volkswagen Id4. Sales in the United States have been a little bit on the slow side, mainly because of production constraints and the fact that currently all Id4 models sold here are actually being built in Europe and then being shipped to the United States. That's all changing with the addition of the new factory in Chattanooga that's going to be building American-bound Id4 models. So expect production to really ramp up and lead times to drop pretty significantly later this year. At the current moment, it takes a pretty long time if you want to get your hands on an Id4. But if you're willing to wait, you will be rewarded with one of the roomiest and least expensive next-generation EVs in America. It starts at $40,760. That gets you the base model with 260 miles of range and about the same kind of power that we find in the Kona EV, only rear-wheel drive. But more important than which wheels are driven, it's the fact that the Id4 is a solid compact crossover. So it is definitely bigger, roomier, more comfy on the inside than the Kona EV. Inside, it is actually pretty similar to the Tucson, the RAV4 CR-V in terms of interior dimensions. So big, generous cargo area, big back seat, and the way that it rides and drives is very mainstream crossover-like. If you're interested in all-wheel drive, the Id4 is currently the least expensive EV with all-wheel drive in the US, but there are rumors that Toyota may claim that crown with the upcoming BZ4X. However, in that corollary, the Id4 is still going to give you a little bit more power and probably a little bit more range as well in real-world driving, although real-world tests are not available just yet for that BZ4X. The Id4 is a really solid vehicle and value is excellent in the lower trims. Keep in mind that Volkswagen hasn't sold too many EVs in the US, so their tax credit looks to be valid for quite some time. Now, if you start taking a look at some of the upper-end trims of Id4, then I would say that an Ioniq 5 or an EV6 or a Mach-E might be a slightly better fit for you. But if you're looking at the $40,000 to $44,000 range, the Id4 is really, really hard to beat. It's also hard to beat if you need to DC fast charge regularly, because every Id4 is going to come with 3 years of unlimited DC fast charging. That's because Volkswagen owns the Electrify America network, which is the biggest CCS DC fast charge network in the US. It's also the only network that is really designed for long-distance interstate travel. So Electrify America is the CCS equivalent, or corollary, I guess you could say, of Tesla's supercharging network. And because Volkswagen owns them, they were able to ink a deal, and 3 years of unlimited DC fast charging can be yours on the Id4. It's not going to charge as fast as many of the other EVs out there. It's just about 125 kW or so, but that is still significantly faster than the Kona, significantly faster than the Bolt EUV, and it's not going to cost you a dime for 3 years. The Kona is an excellent urban electric vehicle. If you're looking for something that's easy to park, has good range for those occasional long road trips, and a reasonable amount of space on the inside, the Kona is an excellent option. But also excellent, the Ioniq 5 and the Id4. The Id4 is really inexpensive. 3 years of DC fast charging is absolutely excellent, especially if you live in an area where regular charging can be tricky. You can go to the DC fast charge station. It doesn't take too long, and it's free. But if you don't want to spend time at all at the DC fast charging station, then the Ioniq 5 is going to be the option for you, because it will go 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes. It is one of the fastest charging EVs that you can buy in 2022. Now, rather unfortunately, the Ioniq 5 is going to be quite a bit more expensive currently. And when we do find that next model in the lineup that's coming a little bit later, the standard range version, you are going to have to trade range and power for that bigger cabin and the DC fast charging. Let me know which way you would go. Are you really interested in that base Ioniq 5? I have to admit, being a little bit torn. I kind of wish it had a little bit more power and perhaps Kona matching range, but I can see exactly why Hyundai did what they have done with that model. Let me know all that down there below in the comment section, and of course, check out the other channels. You'll find those with links down there as well. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, and if you want Alex and Autos merch, you can head over to AOAmerch.com and check that out now. I'll see all of you next week.